Hello and welcome to this course, How to Lead Virtual Teams. My name is Doug Gray, and I'm not sure, today's March 18th, I'm not sure if St. Patrick's Day even happened yesterday anywhere in the world. As you all know, the coronavirus has forced all of us to use virtual tools, and teams are critical as we continue to do our work together. To be clear, there's a bunch of different perspectives on this. One is that we've had virtual teams as long as we've had recorded history. We've always had a fiat from a king or some leader that was distributed to some dislocated or remote team, and then they did or didn't do that. But I think we've got a compelling argument for a lot of more significant changes. In fact, performance to what is a leader? So let's start with the definition. The act of influencing others through socially acceptable behavior that encourages desired behavior in pursuit of a common goal is a wordy definition. Typically, I say, well, I'll give it to you in the next slide. There are 3 points here about leadership. There's confusion. People talk about leaders as if they're the same thing as managers and they use the same skills, and that's simply not the case. With virtual teams, leaders often are the people who open the call. So they might use video cameras, they might demand that everybody do so, and they might create roles within their teams. I think this confusion is a critical place to start. So sometimes I'll say, what hat are you wearing? As a manager, your hat is to maximize the productivity of others, and I'll have people repeat that after me. And then I'll remind them that the primary skill as a manager is to coach. You're coaching for that desired behavior so that people can maximize the productivity of others. This is cut off a little bit, but then I'll do this and have everybody in the room do so with me. What is a leader? A leader is a person who influences the behavior of others toward a better vision of the future. Leaders do not drive off cliffs like Thelma and Louise. Your public optimism is critically important as a leader. So when we signal to an audience in a goofy way, and it could be as dramatic as a manager, yada yada, or it could be as a manager. My job is to maximize your productivity. Therefore, we're going to do this, this, and this. That's a critical skill. I think we're in the business of building better somethings. It could be you're building your reputation. It could be you're building your capacity. But regardless, the expectations increase over time. And it could be that you're fuzzy about whatever you're capable of doing a month from now, or a year from now, or 3 years from now. And there's good reasons to be cautious. Nobody predicted the prevalence of a global pandemic, I don't think, publicly a year ago. Nobody anticipated that you could become the tremendous leader that you're becoming unless you became very intentional about various practices. So let me give you a couple. You've heard me reference Skype and Zoom. There are many of these tools, and I just used this little screenshot to represent two folks in whatever locations they're in. They could, as it's highlighted, move their conversation to chat. They could record it. They could share it in some manner as a resource for anybody else. And then the synchronous Zoom meeting becomes an asynchronous recorded. Also, in WebEx, you can assign the privileges before the event so that people know what their roles are. So if you're a participant or you need to distribute information to all or some, it's easy now to do that. The point, when you're practicing leadership, I think there's two buckets that we commonly use and can do a better job with. So the first I've mentioned here, engagement surveys. We need to measure what matters. And I talked about the Net Promoter Score a second ago. I made reference to a pulse survey, which is something you do just like a pulse or a heartbeat on a regular frequency. It's short, like one sentence. Exit surveys are the things which we commonly do when somebody leaves an organization or your team, and we ask them a handful of questions. You probably know that if you do an exit survey internally, it's not very valid. If you have an external provider, like myself or others do so, there's 60% variance in the data that you get back. Why? Because people are more honest with an external vendor, and it doesn't matter who that person is sometimes. Leadership Trust Index is a thing. To what extent do you trust the leadership in your organization? Boom, that's the index. Well, this has been defined by the International ISO Standard of I've forgotten what ISO stands for. But the example is started in Europe and adopted everywhere, especially by publicly traded companies. Why? Because stakeholders and investors demand that it be measured over time. It's a measure of leadership trust. We're going to see more and more of this. If you're a privately organized company or team, it could be that you've never asked to what extent do you trust the leader in your team. Once you begin to ask this, it's an example of an engagement survey that you will probably be surprised with the data, especially if there's an anonymous capacity to provide feedback. Track those changes, please, and then distribute the results regularly. You may know that engagement surveys over time are flat. Gallup and Pew and others have tracked them for, I think, 50 years now, and it's roughly 30%. So if you ask, how much do you enjoy your work in my team or in my company? It's flat, and roughly 70% of the people say, I'm not engaged, if they're candid, or they say, I'm actively looking for a job elsewhere. There's plenty of data on this. Why is it flat? I think it's in part because we're not using the virtual tools we can to engage people in Slack or Yammer in the moment, other ways in which 50% of the workforce is millennial. That means that they want to be heard and they expect to be heard. And now we've got the tools to be sharing that information. I invite you to use them. A word on executive coaching. There's no better way to provide specific feedback to senior leaders. I think leaders of every level need to practice leadership. And I know, because I've been doing this work since 1997, that there are countless models out there that talk about assessing and developing people, but they're not well adopted. And I'll share the best one in a few minutes. But strengths, weaknesses, how about derailers? How about the things, the behaviors that would cause you to be a less effective person as a leader? These are behavioral. Sometimes people are not aware of them because they've never received them. Another aspect of assessments that help executive coaching are hidden talents. Well, nobody else can articulate those hidden talents as well as an external coach. The value there is a degree of objectivity and best practices from other clients. The value of an internal coach, like the manager, you remember this? Manager's job is to maximize the productivity of others using coaching. Internally, managers, like many of you, will need to maximize that productivity by sharing whatever's important in your organization. That's called alignment. And it's cost effective for you to do so, and critical because you're developing a relationship with those people in your world. So coaching can be external, can be internal, can be synchronous or asynchronous, can be individual and team. The most effective is individual, and I'll share a little bit more on that in a second. So we've talked about leadership generally and ways to use virtual tools to accelerate leadership. I think sometimes about leadership as a progression in my life. And it could be, I've always been focused on leadership development. And it could be that this example is representative for you. So in my teens, I guess, I was in a family that was secure, and I was the eldest of three, and I was expected to do certain things. In my 20s, I worked in remote leadership environments. Outward Bound is an example, and had the opportunity to work with different kinds of people and help them accelerate their leadership skills. In my 30s, I worked in prep schools, independent schools for 12 years, and helped those young students and older adults articulate what it was that they wanted to become. It's all the same story, it's just different environments. In my 40s, I ran a nonprofit in DC for 9 years at a Quaker school, which grew 900%. That is one example of leadership development evolving over time. Since 97, I've been doing this work with executives and leaders because I enjoy working with leaders of leaders. I enjoy having scale. So if I'm working with a Fortune 100 client or 500 client, they are able to impact tens of thousands of people. It could be that your virtual leadership practices, like distributing this little course, sharing these tools with other people, will be as effective because you'll have more scale over time. Hope that makes sense. please just practice leadership. So in a second, we're going to move on to tool 4, which is all about knowledge sharing.